This is Naked Mormonism.
I pledge my life, all that I may have. I will strive to the utmost of my ability to be what you would want me to be.
It's time to find the truth.
And having set our hand to the plow, we will never look back until this work is finished.
Where's the church going?
I have faith that the Constitution will be saved as prophesied by Joseph Smith. But it will not be saved in Washington. It will be saved by enlightened members of this church.
The explicit tag is there for a reason, so if you get offended at what's said, it's not for you. But most importantly,
when you ponder the truths you've heard, may they help you become even better than you were.
Skepticize everything.
Welcome to episode 39 of the Naked Mormonism Podcast, the serial Mormon history podcast. Today is Thursday, September 29th. My name is Bryce Blankenagel, and thank you for joining me. Today, we return to our historical timeline. We're sitting near the end of 1837 in September-ish, and things have never been more challenging in Mormon history before this point. Let's do a quick recap of the last historical timeline episode before we jump into the meat of this week's episode. To start off the last episode, we started talking about the Panic of 1837 and how it affected Mormon history. The total portfolio value of the Kirtland Safety Society anti-banking company was nearly $4 million, backed by barely more than $20,000 in actual money, or specie as they called it. Joe and Rigdon were running the church into the ground at the same time that the worldwide economy was amidst collapse. They were just dragging everybody in the church down with them. Many prominent leaders, however, wouldn't go down without a fight. Orson Brainpower Pratt and his brother, P. Parley Parker Pratt, along with Sylvester Smith, Professor Bill E. McClellan, and others were apostates and preaching against Joe and Rigdon to congregations. Ollie Cowdung, Oliver Cowdery, was nearing apostate status, while not-so-smarty Marty Harris was about to leave. D-Day David and John Goebbels Whitmer were both apostates running the church in Missouri against the will of Joe and Rigdon in Kirtland. The leadership was fracturing and melting down at an unprecedented level, all while members of the 11 witnesses were preaching against Joe and Rigdon's best interests. The 11 witnesses to the golden plates were questioning Joe as the prophet. It's hard to imagine that Joe and the church will emerge victorious on the other side of 1838. And I would make an argument that they didn't breach this fog of war until about 1840 or 41. But the exciting thing is, we have so much to cover until we can officially declare Joe victorious over this descent that was going on. So let's dive in. If you need a better refresher than that, listen to episode 38 and come back and, there's just too much for us to recap. Too much happened for us to cover in the milk of today's show. So that being said, let's dive into the meat for today and get our proper fill for the rest of 1837. Hopefully by the end of this episode, we'll be discussing the beginnings of the Missouri Mormon War, but judging from the notes that I have so far, I kind of doubt that. It's been building up since the establishment of independence as Zion in 1831, and it concludes nearing the end of 1838. But I don't think we're going to get that far. So last episode, P. Parley Parker Pratt, we know him, preached on the stand for 2 hours about how the church had gone astray, and he did so in early June of 1837. Well, we know that P. was a leader in the church in Salt Lake City and was subsequently killed in 1857 because of his polygamous practices, which eventually led to the Mountain Meadows Massacre, just north and west of Cedar City, I believe. P. reconciled his problems with the church, but we need to know some of the details of his problems to gain some insight on the real Joe. We're going to read from P. autobiography in a minute here, so we know the reconciliation process that he went through. But we need to read a letter that he wrote to Joe in May of 1837 to understand the feelings between these two men. We briefly covered this last episode, but looking back at it now, there are some details worth pointing out that lead us into a discussion about a hearing Joe stood on trial for the following month in Painesville, Ohio. This letter was originally published on March 24th, 1838 in Zion's Watchman, but I'm taking it from Fawn Brody's No Man Knows My History, the 1970 edition, pages 201 to 203. This is from, P. Cubed, Parley Parker Pratt to Joseph Smith. Quote, "And now, dear brother, if you are still determined to pursue this wicked course until yourself and the church shall sink down to hell, I beseech you at least to have mercy on me and my family and others who are bound with me. For those 3 lots of land which you sold me at the extraordinary price of $2,000, which never cost you $100. For if it stands against me, it will ruin me and my helpless family, as well as those bound with me. For yesterday, President Rigdon came to me and informed me that you had drawn the money from the bank on the obligations which you held against me, and that you had left it to the mercy of the bank, and could not help whatever course they might take to collect it. Notwithstanding the most sacred promises on your part that I should not be injured by those writings, I offered him the 3 lots for the writings, but he wanted my house and home also." This is P. Cube's complaint that Joseph sold 3 plots of property to him at a wildly inflated price. It continues, "Now, dear brother, will you take those lots and give me up the writings and pay me the $75 which I paid you on the same? Or will you take the advantage of your neighbor because he is in your power? If not, I shall be under the painful necessity of preferring charges against you for extortion, covetousness, and taking advantage of your brother by an undue religious influence. Such as saying it is the will of God that lands should bear with such a price, and many other prophesyings, preachings, and statements of a like nature." End quote. So I think Pratt made a really good point that I almost skimmed over in last episode. Joe was in a position of power as the church leader, the prophet, and he made this real estate deal that really fucked over P. Cubed. Joe basically bought some land, 3 plots of land for $75, and then turned around and immediately sold it to P. Cubed for $2,000. But when P. Cubed went to the bank to repay the debt in actual specie, the $75, he didn't have enough real money to cover the deal. So the Kirtland Safety Society Company tried to repossess his home and current properties as collateral against the $2,000 loan. P. Cubed went to Joe and called him out on the bullshit, saying that Joe was extorting him, claiming that the price of the land was the will of God. P. Cubed makes a good point here. Joe was the ecclesiastical leader and had no problem in using his position to coerce willing followers to buy into his bullshit. This was in early June of 1837. The Panic of 1837 had hit, and according to Brody, more than 800 banks had failed nationwide, popping a bubble of $120 million in assets. By the end of this same month, Joe sold off all his assets in the Kirtland Safety Society Company, advising his family members and friends to do the same, which resulted in nearly 1/5 of the company's assets changing hands. I'm going to keep reading from No Man Knows My History here to get a proper idea for just how fucked everything really was. I also have to thank Brody in absentia for her eloquent writing style that really brings this era of Mormon history to life. Quote, "The toppling of the Kirtland Bank loosed a hornet's nest. Creditors swarmed in upon Joseph armed with threats and warrants. He was terribly in debt. There's no way of knowing exactly how much he and his leading elders had borrowed, since the loyal Mormons left no itemized account of their own claims. But the local non-Mormon creditors, whom he could not repay, brought a series of suits against the prophet, which the Geiga County Court duly recorded. These records tell a story of trouble that would have demolished the prestige and broken the spirit of a lesser man. 13 suits were brought against him between June of 1837 and April of 1839 to collect sums totaling nearly $25,000. The damages asked amounted to almost $35,000. He was arrested 7 times in 4 months, and his followers managed heroically to raise the $38,428 required for bail. Of the 13 suits, only 6 were settled out of court. About 12,000 out of the total 25,000. In the other 7, the creditors either were awarded damages or won them by default. Joseph had many additional debts that never resulted in court action. Some years later, he compiled a list of still outstanding Kirtland loans, which amounted to more than $33,000. If one adds to these 2 great loans of $30,000 and $60,000 borrowed in New York and Buffalo in 1836, it would seem that the Mormon leaders owed to non-Mormon individuals and firms well over $150,000. End quote. Back at episode 36, I said that I perceived an evolution of Joe from being like this doesn't give a shit party boy to becoming a mob boss that established a secret hit squad and counterfeit banking company at the end of 1836. I think Joe really embodies this mob boss mentality when it comes to the corporation of the Church of Christ in 1837. From this complaint that P. Cubed made, he was a made man from the earliest days in the church. He miraculously converted in late 1830 after having made some random trip to Palmyra to visit the young prophet Joe. Of course, if you buy into the Spalding authorship theory for the Book of Mormon, Pratt was Rigdon's closest assistant. P. Cubed and Hinchpin Rigdon worked in concert, and Pratt was one of the 2 go-between people connecting Joe and Rigdon while the Book of Mormon was being written. Of course, Ollie was the other person in that quadrifecta. Pratt enjoyed inhabiting the highest echelons of Mormondom since basically the beginning of the church. After Joe fucked him over with these 3 plots sold at a 2,600% markup, Pratt was walking on thin ice with publicly voicing complaints against the prophet's extortion, because that's what it was, extortion. Joe didn't take this insurrection from his faithful underling very well. Unfortunately for us all, we'll never know the exact exchange between Joe and P. Cubed here, but we can read from the autobiography of P. Cubed, which seems to thinly veil the dissonance between Joe as the boss and P. Cubed as one of many underbosses. So this is P. Cubed, Parley P. Pratt's entry from his own autobiography, which is hosted on boap.org. That's a Book of Abraham project. The link for this will be in the show notes. Quote, "About this time, after I had returned from Canada, there were jarrings and discords in the church at Kirtland, and many fell away and became enemies and apostates. There were also envyings, lyings, strifes, and divisions which caused much trouble and sorrow. By such spirits I was also accused, misrepresented, and abused. And at one time I was also overcome by the same spirit in a great measure, and it seemed as if the very powers of darkness which war against the saints were let loose upon me. But the Lord knew my faith, my zeal, my integrity of purpose, and he gave me the victory. I went to Brother Joseph Smith in tears, and with a broken heart and contrite spirit, confessed wherein I had erred in spirit, murmured or done and said amiss. He frankly forgave me, prayed for me, and blessed me. On this, the day of my daughter's wedding. Thus, by my experience, I learned more fully to discern and to contrast the 2 spirits, and to resist the one and cleave to the other. And being tempted in all points, even as others, I learned how to bear with and excuse and succor those who are tempted." P. Cubed continues, "Late in July, I arrived in the city of New York on a mission, took lodgings, and commenced to preach and write. My first production in that city was a book of upwards of 200 pages entitled The Voice of Warning. The first edition of this work consisted of 4,000 copies. It has since been published and republished in America and Europe till some 40 or 50,000 copies have not been sufficient to supply the demand. Thousands date their conversion to the fullness of the gospel to reading that book." End quote. So just briefly, this book that P. Cubed wrote, this Voice of Warning, is actually a frequently cited manual for missionaries even today. I mean, it's lasted this long. Pratt was a prolific and intelligent writer, a trait which must have run in the family because his brother, Orson Pratt, has the nickname of Orson Brainpower Pratt because he was an amazing science lecturer and an engineer. P. Cubed wrote this book, The Voice of Warning treatise, which helped distribute the evolving Mormonism to missions in Canada, the New England area, and even overseas to the newly created missions in actual England. This was an offering. That's my interpretation, my naked version of the story and how I'm viewing it anyways. This was a time in Mormon history where Joe wasn't sure who he could trust. Some of his most faithful followers and closest friends that had been so for half a decade, men that had signed their names as witness to the gold plates, were preaching against the church. If somebody were to stay a trusted brother of the Mormon fraternity, they needed to express their loyalty by an offering. And that's just what happened with P. Cubed here, in my opinion. You see, Joe had fucked over P. Cubed with his life savings in this business deal that, he sold this property at a 2,600% markup. Then something happened to make P. Cubed come groveling back to Joe, a broken man wallowing in his own sorrow and apostasy, asking Joe for forgiveness. To be truly forgiven, Joe needed P. Cubed to go on a mission and preach the code of the fraternity to the new converts in the New England area. Go get some new recruits and spend some time away from your friends and family to think about what you did when you preached against the one true prophet of God. That's what Joe was telling P. Cubed to do. Now, this entire time that Pratt was on hiatus during this mission, he didn't just write this 200-page book, called The Voice of Warning. He also penned a 50-page book called Mormonism Unveiled, Zion's Watchmen Unmasked. Now, you might remark, Mormonism Unveiled was published by Eber Howe in 1834, and you're correct. This book that P. Cubed wrote in conjunction with his Voice of Warning was the first book-sized major publication that was a direct response to an anti-Mormon book by Eber Howe, the actual Mormonism Unveiled. Various articles and small pamphlets had been published by Ollie, Joe, and Rigdon and others to refute occasional anti-Mormon sentiments that may have been floating around the news cycle and whatnot, but this was the first time ever in Mormon history that they published an entire book response that was created strictly as a response to a specific anti-Mormon publication, and gave it the same name. It's really a shame that it took them over 3 years to get that refutation written, and it wouldn't be published until early 1838. That's a lot of damage that was done by Eber Howe's actual Mormonism Unveiled for nearly 4 years before this book became widely available. And of course, the Mormon version of Mormonism Unveiled that P. Cubed wrote, it didn't sell in anywhere near the numbers of that Howe's book sold. Amazingly enough, the church back then was just as sluggish to answer anti-Mormon literature as they are today. It's absolutely remarkable, isn't it? A recurring theme. Maybe sometime I'll read that book and just summarize it in an episode or something, because Howe's book, the actual Mormonism Unveiled, was the first Mormon history book that I ever read. One of the oldest books in Mormon, anti-Mormon publications out there. So it seems fitting to read the Mormon refutation of it as well. But more on that later. So Joe was mad with P. Cubed, right? And this was the restitution or the gift offering that P. Cubed offered in return as a show of loyalty. Pratt would be loyal to the church for the rest of his days after this. He went through a trial and passed. Joe knew that he could trust P. Cubed. And it's lucky for Joe at this point, because the list of fraternity members that he could really trust was getting shorter and shorter as the days wore on and the global economy got worse. Now, it needs to be pointed out, P. Cubed wasn't the only one. Dissent was happening everywhere. And it wasn't just in Kirtland or just far west. In mid-September of 1837, a man named Snyder left the church in England, and he burned 200 copies of the Book of Mormon as he left. A person doesn't burn a book unless they're really angry about something. So you can imagine that this Snyder guy was one of the more disenchanted members of the church during this time of frequent defection. At that same time that Snyder burned these 200 books of Mormon, P-Cubed released his books, Voice of Warning and the Mormonism Unveiled, the Mormon version. And this was just furthering the persecution narrative of people in the church that apostatize and want to see the church burn along with every copy of the Book of Mormon. The church was claiming this persecution narrative, and there were people literally burning books of Mormon. It needs to be stated that the church had a fair number of enemies during this time. These enemies could have been members that, disaffected, as in the case of Snyder that burned the Books of Mormon, or they could be ardent antagonists of Joe and the church, like Eber Howe was, editor of the Painesville Telegraph that published Mormonism Unveiled, in 1834. Painesville was the nearest neighboring city to Kirtland and Mentor, making it the largest population in Ohio that was adversely affected by the Mormons. We know from last episode that Painesville didn't like Joe. When he tried to board a steamer there to head for Canada, he was stopped or arrested like 5 or 6 times before he could flee town and try to leave for Canada through Ashtabula the next day. Well, after digging a little bit deeper, one of these arrests was a little more sinister than the others, and it required a bail of $500 be posted before Joe could even leave Painesville on that frustrating day. Something happened involving a man named Grandison Newell. He's our antagonist for the story. His name has come up once or twice in our timeline before, but he was never terribly distinguished before now. Grandison Newell was known as one of the most outspoken anti-Mormons in the mid to late 1830s. He wrote dozens of articles about the Mormons, and in May and June of 1837, he had an open letter exchange with Hinchpin Sidney Rigdon that was published in the Painesville Telegraph, the editor of which was Eber Howe. Now, we have reprints of these letters that were reprinted in other newspapers, but suffice it to say, some of the shit that Grandison Newell was throwing at Joe and Rigdon was pretty smelly at this time. I'm going to read a few excerpts in a row, and we'll talk about them as we go, but I think it captures this anti-Mormon attitude quite well. These are taken from SidneyRigdon.com, a site that's run by Dale Broadhurst. There's a link for it in the show notes. This is Grandison Newell's open letter exchange to Sidney Rigdon, letter number 1, quote, "To Sidney Rigdon at Palmyra, Waterloo, Shenango Point, Pittsburgh, Massachusetts, Maine, or some other place where his business calls him. Sir, I perceive from your letter that though your journey, like your moral course, is so serpentine, so crooked that the devil himself might be puzzled to follow you, yet the fear of sheriffs and constables has been a ghost on your track. No wonder. You have committed such incredible wickedness in pretending to direct revelations from heaven, in aiding Joe Smith in ruining so many deluded but innocent families, in giving countenance to assassins, and swindling community by means of your rag money, that it is not at all surprising that the sheriff with the appropriate implements for execution should constantly be present to your imagination, and that you should undergo nightly in your dreams the merited punishment of your atrocious deeds. There is no peace to the wicked. You have opened the correspondence with me, and now I must discharge my duty to you and the people whom you and Joe Smith are seeking to enthrall and betray to ruin. You have become a villain so desperate, a swindler so bold, that you are lost to all good, and advice to you about reformation is idle preaching, but your intended victims may be saved by learning your true character." Now, Grandison Newell goes on to give us the story of Sidney Rigdon. He goes on, quote, "You came to Mentor in a cloak of religion, pretending to be a Baptist. Suddenly you changed to a Campbellite, and lastly to a Mormon. But when you appeared, the best men of discretion and observation plainly saw that under this cloak you concealed a heart desperately wicked. On embracing Mormonism, you became a co-worker with Joe Smith, the prophet and imposture and evil. You and him have been successful in collecting at Kirtland some 300 or 400 honest but ignorant and credulous people by basely perverting their religious sentiments, and you subjected them by pretending to act by the authority of the great and good being whom all the conscientious revere to a system of tyranny and plunder that has overwhelmed them in ruin. Some are in a state of starvation, some are all mad, all in despair. Families you have separated, warm hopes of happiness blighted. You have put asunder whom God joined together, and when this widespread desolation among your followers was pressed on your attention, you mocked at their calamities, told those whom your wily arts collected with promises of great spiritual and temporal good to disperse or starve. In my next, I shall examine some other points of your character and conduct. Signed, Grandison Newell, published Painesville, May 17th, 1837. Wow. I think it can be said that Grandison Newell really did not like Sidney Rigdon. But wait, because there's a shorter letter that seems even more violent. The letter number 2. This was published in later in May of 1837. Quote, "It is an old remark that a man is known by the company he keeps. Your bosom associate in the imposture, Smith, the impious fabricator of gold plates, the blasphemous forger of revelations, with which he swindles ignorant people out of their hard-earned property. His audacity does not stop with the property. Emboldened by success in his wicked schemes, he hesitates not to use his authority as the revelator of the will of heaven, to incite his followers to remove those who have opposed his treachery and fraud by assassination. Deluded and frantic by his pretended revelation that it was the will of God that I should be destroyed. 2 of the saints of the latter day, by concert and under the express direction of their prophet, this high priest of Satan, meet in the night at a little distance from my house with loaded rifles and pistols with a determination to kill me. But as they draw near to the spot where the bloody deed was to be performed, they trembled under the awful responsibility of committing murder. A little cool reflection in darkness and silence broke the spell of the false prophet. They were restored to their right minds, and are now rejoicing that they were not left to the power of the devil and the coadjutor, Smith, to stain their souls with a crime so horrible. While these scenes were planned by the prophet and promises of great temporal and spiritual good lavished upon these 2 men by him to stimulate them to assassinate me in my house, in the midst of my family, and in a moment when I was defenseless and suspecting no danger, you were busy in preaching the infallibility of the prophet, and with an impudence and volubility peculiar to yourself, sustaining his ridiculous and heaven-daring pretensions to the power of working miracles. And it requires more charity than a good man is required to possess, to believe that while you were clamorously holding him forth as a prophet, you did not know that he was exerting his influence over the bewildered followers to procure my death, because I fearlessly exposed to the contempt and indignation of an outraged community your flagitious plans. It is not time for the people to give attention to impostors who preach murder and assassination by pretended revelations from heaven. Signed, Grandison Newell. End quote. When somebody talks about an anti-Mormon person or a book or publication or whatever, few better examples come to mind than Grandison Newell. He was living in the town neighboring Mormon headquarters in Kirtland, and he was probably good friends with Eber Howe, who was editor of the Painesville Telegraph and quintessential anti-Mormon writer in all Mormon history. These 2 men, Grandison Newell and Eber Howe, were wreaking havoc in the press about the Mormons, especially since the Kirtland Safety Society company had been erected and was in the middle of collapse with hundreds of other banks around the country. But just picking out some of his verbiage, your journey, like your moral course, is so serpentine, so crooked that the devil himself might be puzzled to follow you. I mean, these are things that Grandison Newell was saying to Sidney Rigdon in an open letter exchange. You have become a villain so desperate, a swindler so bold, that you are lost to all good, and advice to you about reformation is idle preaching. I mean, here's some more examples, but your intended victims may be saved by learning your true character. You subjected them by pretending to act by the authority of the great and good being whom all conscientious revere to a system of tyranny and plunder, all these punch words, that has overwhelmed them in ruin. I mean, it's just amazing. It is not time for the people to give attention to imposters who preach murder and assassination by pretended revelation from heaven. This is anti-Mormon. Calling Rigdon evil and villainous and claiming him to be preaching blasphemies because they come into conflict with one's own personal religious beliefs is exactly anti-Mormon, and honestly, it's ignorant and bigoted. This is persecution. Newell understood that the Mormon Church was a false religion, and thus the leadership were leading people astray, preaching from the mouth of the devil instead of the mouth of the Lord and whatnot. I mean, this is purely a theological condemnation of Joe and Rigdon based on Newell's own understanding of God. That's a purely anti-Mormon sentiment. That is, condemning these men for what they believe and the religion they practice, the definition of which is anti-Mormon in this case. The problem we run into is the fact that there may be some nuggets of truth buried in Newell's claims that are overshadowed by his condemnation of the Mormon religion itself. Now, Newell was outright claiming that there were two men tasked with assassinating him, a task that was given by the prophet, and that these people were waiting outside of Newell's home one evening to commit the crime. He also claimed that these people lost their nerve and that his life was spared as a byproduct of their cowardice. Those are some pretty strong claims. But the anti-Mormon name-calling is tightly interwoven with these small bits of possible truth in multiple different sentences. I mean, listen to these sentences. You have committed such incredible wickedness in pretending to direct revelations from heaven. And that's anti-Mormon. In aiding Joe Smith in ruining so many deluded but innocent families. That's factual. Joe Smith did ruin so many families. He did delude a lot of people that were completely innocent. In giving countenance to assassins and swindling community by means of your rag money. Now, the countenance to assassins, that might be true as well. In swindling a community by means of your rag money, that is also 100% true. Now, that's the problem. I mean, these anti-Mormon claims are interwoven with possible nuggets of truth. Let's take another one, for example. You came to mentor in a cloak of religion, pretending to be a Baptist. Suddenly you changed to a Campbellite, and lastly to a Mormon. Well, those are facts. Those are facts of what Sidney Rigdon did in his preaching life, starting in the late 18-teens, and early 1820s. It goes on to say, and lastly to a Mormon, but when you appeared, the best men of discretion and observation plainly saw that under the cloak you concealed a heart desperately wicked. Now that's purely anti-Mormon. That's anti-Mormon right there, saying somebody is wicked because they are preaching claims against your own theological convictions. Emboldened by success in his wicked schemes, he hesitates not to use his authority as a revelator of the will of heaven to incite his followers to remove those who have opposed his treachery and fraud by assassination. Now, emboldened by success in his wicked schemes, that's anti-Mormon. But then saying that he hesitated not, speaking of Joseph in this case, to use his authority as the revelator, as the prophet, to incite followers for assassination attempts, that is a possible truth claim. That's a truth claim that we need to examine that's couched within anti-Mormon rhetoric. Now, historians like to call this a problem with the historical record because it's so biased, but I honestly consider it more of a characteristic. We know that Grandison Newell was viciously opposed to Joe Rigdon and the church. He obviously hated them, and he'd been on a campaign to smear them for years, as had Eber D. Howe, that published Mormonism Unveiled. These were anti-Mormon persecutors. This strong bias clouds the information and makes it harder to determine what really happened. I say that's not necessarily an obstacle, but a trait that helps us to see the human element inside the historical record. It would be nice if we knew for sure that Joe ordered a hit on Newell, but there's no way to tell for sure. What is important to understand is that Newell either considered an assassination attempt to have happened, or He was just trying a new tactic in his smear campaign against the Mormons by framing the prophet with false claims of an assassination attempt. Now, that's two sides of the same coin. Either the assassination attempt happened or it didn't happen and Newell claimed that it happened. But regardless of Newell's sincerity or how accurate his record of events is, we know that word was circulating that the Mormon prophet ordered an assassination against a vicious anti-Mormon reporter. The historical fact is that word was circulating that an assassination attempt had happened. Joe or Rigdon may have ordered it. They may not have. It all may have been just a fabrication by Newell. But that doesn't really matter. What does matter is that public opinion was easily swayed by headlines that were being published in the Painesville Telegraph and other places. And somebody like Grandison Newell could use this influence in order to shape public opinion against Mormons. Now, if we remember back to the Hoffman episodes, I made the point that sometimes local reporting is the best source we have access to. While the day-to-day headlines in local newspapers may not report the bigger picture of a large story, when it comes to capturing the attitude of the general population at the time that something occurred, local newspapers are invaluable to historians looking back on events because they capture the attitude. They capture the feeling that people had at the time when a certain story broke. So Newell had published these newspaper articles in late May 1837. This open letter exchange between him and Sidney Rigdon. While at the same time, P. Cubed was preaching his 2-hour sermon against Joe and Rigdon, and many church members were questioning the legitimacy of the church as a whole due to the Kirtland Safety Society company failure. Newell couldn't have picked a better time to be an anti-Mormon reporter, as public scrutiny was beginning to laser in on that wacky Mormon cult in Kirtland run by a deadly duo mob bosses Joe and Rigdon, who, according to Newell, would stop at nothing to get their own way, even if that means assassinating a reporter. On June 9th, Joe and a number of church leaders were in Painesville trying to board a steamer to head for Canada. And we know this from Bloody Brigham's autobiography in the last historical episode. That's when we read that. Joe was arrested multiple times and stood trial once that day, with a bail of $500 that was promptly paid. The Painesville Telegraph for that day has the court proceeding in its entirety. And we're gonna read it, because it's like a scene from A Few Good Men. I mean, a bunch of heavy hitters in the church that were in Painesville that day testified about the attempted assassination of Grandison Newell and what they knew about it. Now let's read it, taken from the same source as the previous two articles from Uncle Dale's archives online. There's a link for it in the show notes. Before reading this, it's kind of a long chunk of text to read, but it's important enough. I have to tell you that Fawn Brody estimated that this was the 13th time that Joe had been on trial since 1826. Now, that's an average of more than one lawsuit per year in different states for unrelated offenses. Now, we haven't read a court document in a while because it would literally fill too much of the show and it may just get monotonous. But this was a trial on charges that Joe commanded members of the Brother of Gideon Society to assassinate a newspaper reporter because he was regularly publishing anti-Mormon articles that would spread like wildfire. This trial was an escalation. This shit was the next level. The previous trials about Joseph Smith have been, involving him like dodging out on money that he owes to a person or a group of people, or for assaulting Dr. Philastus Hurlput, the excommunicated ex-missionary guy who gathered the evidence for the Spalding theory and sold it to Eber Howe for Mormonism Unveiled. I mean, this time, Grandison Newell, Eber Howe's friend, now you see how the pieces between those three fit together, was claiming that Joe organized and gave the order to a Mormon hit squad on a guy that was publishing articles against the church. This is the next level. The stakes have never been this high. If it's proven in court that Joe commanded members of the church to kill somebody by the will of God, and those men in the hit squad only did so to follow the orders of God's prophet, that changes a lot of things about Mormonism. The entire public perception of Mormonism could transform into being their own armed militia with a squad of willing hitmen. Not to mention that if proven guilty, it would probably send Joe and Rigdon to the gallows. I mean, a lot was riding on the outcome of this trial in 1837. That seems to almost remind me of one of the Kefauver trials or something. So let's read the court document. Like I said, it's a little bit long, but the information is fantastic. And just as we're reading through the witness testimonies, just try and put yourself there. Envision what it would have been like to actually be sitting in the court, seeing these people up on trial in such a high-stakes environment. This is taken straight from the Painesville Telegraph, published June 9th, 1837. Quote, "Much interest and anxiety seemed to be manifested by the good people of Painesville on Saturday the 3rd of June, in consequence of a suit instituted in behalf of the state of Ohio on the complaint of Mr. Grandison Newell against the defendant, charging him with an attempt to take the life of said complainant, by inducing two individuals to lay in wait for said Newell near his dwelling in order to shoot him, which trial was held on the day at the townhouse in this village before Justice Flint. Below will be found a brief, but we trust substantially correct account of the trial. The State of Ohio versus Joseph Smith, Jr., alias the Prophet. Mr. Hyde, for the prosecution called." Now I have to assume this is Orson Hyde, or as we know him, Orson LaHaidem. This is before his mission out to Jerusalem. "He testified that sometime in January or February last, he was in the bank called the Mormon Bank, where others were in conversation, Smith recounting the hardships and privations they had endured and were still subject to, and that threats had been uttered against the bank and its officers, that it was possible a suit might be commenced against them. But, said he, I know of no one who would do such a thing, except it is Mr. Newell." Alright, so Joe and a few people, including Orson Hyde, were in the Kirtland Bank in February or January talking about the troubles that were going on about the church and that a lawsuit might come up. And they said, Mr. Newell is, if anybody's going to bring up a lawsuit, Grandison Newell, the antagonist for today's episode, is going to be the guy that does it. It goes on to say, "Smith seemed much excited and declared that Newell should be put out of the way, or where the crows could not find him." Put out of the way. He said destroying Newell would be justifiable in the sight of God, that it was the will of God, etc. Witness said he had never heard Smith use similar language before. Not long after witness conversed with Smith on the subject, asked him what he meant by such language. He said he had no intention to hurt Newell, but that the course followed by Newell, and there's an illegible word there, blank him, that he felt injured and had spoken rashly inadvertently in the heat of passion. To the question, does Smith claim to be a prophet? Witness answered, he does sometimes. So that was Hyde's testimony, and they go on to question and cross-examine. Question, do the members of your society feel bound to receive Smith's words as revelation? Answer, we do when what he reveals is in accordance with the work of God, but feel bound to receive nothing farther than it agrees with the Scripture. Question, was there ever a revelation made by Smith which was doubted by you? Answer, yes. There have been things advanced by Smith which we did not believe. Myself and others have conversed together on the expressions of Smith, made in reference to Newell. We thought we were not bound to receive it as the revealed will of God. Now it goes on to the cross-examination. Cross-examined. A witness thinks the meeting at the bank was in January or February. There were a number present with myself, Mr. Parrish, that's Warren Parrish, Mr. Calhoun, John C. Calhoun, and others whose names I do not recollect at this time. Now this is the cross-examination questions. Question, who participated with Smith in this conversation about Newell? Answer, I heard no one make any reply to what he said. Question, does the witness think that Smith intended to take the life of Newell? Answer, I cannot say that I do, though I felt some alarm, spoke to others of it. Question: how was the expression of Smith concerning Newell received by you? Answer: we did not receive it as a revelation. We received nothing as such, except what accords with the Old and New Testaments. Question: how long have you been acquainted with Smith, and what is your opinion of his character as a man? Answer: I have known him for some time, and think him to be possessed of much kindness and humanity towards his fellow beings. Question: does Mr. Newell come among you frequently, or does he seem to shun your place through fear? Answer: I have seen him at Kirtland once or twice lately, apparently without fear coming among us. Direct examination resumed of Orson Hyde. All who were present at the conversation in the bank were both officers of the society and of the bank. Cross-examination resumed. I have conversed with Mr. Newell on the subject of the prosecution of the officers of the bank and the threats of Smith against him. He inquired of me whether I would support Smith or turn against him. I told him that I hoped truth might ever prevail with me, but there was much prejudice existing among the members of our society against him, in consequence of his heading a mob to disturb us. Should not swerve from truth and fairness, even should it go against Smith. Final question: has there ever been any difficulty between yourself and Smith? Answer: yes. There has been at times about the printing press and concerning Newell. So that was Orson Hyde's testimony. And he gave this up on the stand, and the questions basically were, do you hear a conversation about Joseph Smith saying that Newell should be put out of the way? And Orson Hyde answered basically yes, and there were a bunch of people that heard this conversation, and he had never heard Joseph talk about it like this before, never heard these kind of words come out of Joseph's mouth. This was, something new to him, Joe saying that somebody should be put out of the way in this case. And then, of course, the prosecution continued to ask more questions, and then the cross-examination continue asking questions about how the public persona was of Newell, how people perceived Grandison Newell in Kirtland, and people around Kirtland didn't like him. Obviously, Newell was villainized as an anti-Mormon writer, and he was publishing things constantly against the church, so church members didn't like him. And then, of course, one of the questions was, does Newell ever come into Kirtland, or do you think that he stays away out of fear? And Orson Hyde said, well, I've seen him a couple times. He doesn't seem to mind coming and hanging out in Kirtland. So, kind of interesting there. That's a testimony from Orson Hyde. He was apparently one of the people that was present when he heard this conversation of Joseph Smith saying that Grandison Newell needs to be put out of the way. And what was the second part of that? Or where the crows could not find him. Saying that destroying Newell would be justified in the sight of God and that it was the will of God. That's some pretty strong language going on. So the next testimony that's brought up was Solomon Denton. So there were two people involved in this assassination attempt. We have Solomon Denton and a man named Davis. Now, Davis doesn't actually stand up and take the witness stand at all, but Solomon Denton does, and that's the next testimony. So before this, we just had Orson Hyde standing up there, a leader in the church, a faithful member of the church, and he had supposedly heard this actual this assassination order from Joseph Smith. So now we're going to Denton, who was possibly guilty of trying to carry this out. It goes on, quote, Solomon Denton called. Witness says that in April or May 1835, he lived with Smith and was a member of the society. At that time, there was much excitement among the members about Newell, his raising a mob, etc. One afternoon, I saw Mr. Davis, who said he wished to speak to me privately. We withdrew to a private room, and after consulting together about putting Newell out of the way, I went to Mr. Cowdery's, borrowed a pair of pistols, cleaned, loaded and fired them once, then loaded them again. And as I returned, saw Smith, who said he wished to speak with me. Wow. So this is actually kind of intense. So, after Joe gave, this order, basically, Davis came up to Denton and talked to him about it, saying, hey, we gotta go kill this guy. And Denton said, okay, and he went to Oliver Cowdery's house. I think it's Oliver Cowdery. It says Mr. Cowdery. It could have been Warren Cowdery or somebody else, but I think it was Oliver Cowdery. and where he borrowed a pair of pistols and he cleaned and loaded them, test fired them, make sure that they were working, and then loaded them again, getting them ready to actually shoot and kill somebody. Then after he did this little exercise with the guns, he returned and he saw Smith, who supposedly wished to speak with him. And we're about to hear what Smith and Denton talked about at this time. "We retired to the garden. He said to me, 'I know where you are going and what your business is.' That he had seen Davis and told him I would be a good hand to go with him. Said this was a great work, and we must be very wise. Then spake of Newell. Said he had injured the society, that it was better for one man to suffer than to have the whole community disturbed, that it was the will of heaven that Newell should be put out of the way, and that he would take the responsibility, for the deed was justifiable in the sight of God, and would be rewarded. But when we had killed him, he wanted his body secreted if possible." That's an important detail. Joseph came up and talked to Denton after Denton had test fired these pistols borrowed from Cowdery. And Joseph said, "It is the will of heaven, and it's justifiable in the sight of God that Newell should be put out of the way, and that Denton would be rewarded as long as he secreted the body after they killed him. One man should suffer, then a whole nation dwindle in unbelief." That's a typical Mormon phrase. That's a perfect example of what happened here. The court documents continue. "Here the witness was about to detail the conversation between Davis and Smith as related to him by Davis, which was objected to by the counsel of the defendant and declared inadmissible by court. Objection, that's hearsay." That's what happened there. The witness then proceeded to say that Smith told him he wished to God the deed had been done and hoped it would not be given up, that heaven would reward the doers of a deed so just, and etc. After supper, witness met Davis on the east and west road not far from Elijah Smith's house. After some hurried expressions from each on the atrocity of the crime, they separated. That was Denton's testimony, and he went on to start talking about the conversation that Davis had between Smith, but since Davis wasn't there and Smith wouldn't talk about that conversation on the stand, it was an objection by the defendant and it was declared hearsay and inadmissible. Fair enough, that happens. So it goes on to the questioning of Solomon Denton here. Question, was Smith held as a prophet by his followers? That seems like a fairly obvious question given everything that Denton had said up to this point. You know, it was the will of God to put Newell out of the way, you know. The witness proceeded to say that Smith told him he wished to God the deed had been done and hoped it would be given up, and that heaven would reward the doers of a deed. So it's kind of hard to argue that Smith wasn't using his ecclesiastical position of authority to justify this assassination attempt. So the question was Smith held as a prophet by his followers? Answer, he was. I had ever been taught by both Smith and Cowdery to regard him as such. You know, the cross-examination question. I first saw Smith in the state of New York in the year of 1830. Did not embrace his religion until I came to Kirtland in 1831. Since then, I have been to Missouri, for Zion's camp, was a member of the society there, returned in 1833 or 34. When I returned to Kirtland, I engaged in the printing business, carried on by Davis, Rigdon, Cowdery, and Smith. Smith was sometimes called into the office to reprimand me for not obeying what I considered unjust and tyrannical requirements. Question, did you ever use pistols for any other purpose than destroying Newell? Answer, yes. I have used them to guard Smith's house. Question, did you never get pistols to waylay Smith? Answer, no, though such has been reported. So there we go. Apparently somebody had claimed that Denton was hired to kill Smith and was given pistols for that purpose. But he said no, even though that's been the public report. Yeah, kind of interesting because Denton was a faithful member at this time. Question, are you a member of the society now? Answer, I am not. I was excommunicated about 2 months since for lack of faith, non-observance of duties, and contempt of the quorum of high priests. I left Kirtland about 5 weeks ago, went to Michigan to visit my family. Now, somebody might take that answer right there and say, so this guy was excommunicated from the church, and then he stood on trial and claimed that Joseph Smith told him to go kill somebody. A very damning and hard to excuse claim from an ex-Mormon, somebody that was excommunicated. Somebody could say that's just a fabrication. It's just religious persecution and that this never actually happened. Because an excommunicated anti-Mormon was the person giving this testimony. I don't know what to say about that necessarily. I think we'll talk about that a little bit more after reading through the court documents, but just think about that. Keep that in mind. You know, somebody that was saying that Smith told him to go kill somebody, he'd been excommunicated from the church when he said that. So, question: had you any conversation with Smith about the Newell affair before you went to Michigan? Answer: I had. He told me he expected to be prosecuted, and that he had heard I would swear against him. He then urged me upon the necessity of favoring him and the society. Yeah, that's interesting. So, once Denton had been excommunicated from the church and he was on his way to Michigan, Joseph came up to him and said, "Hey, I know that you're mad, but I don't want to be prosecuted here. So can you favor me and the society as opposed to the anti-Mormons that are, that I'm trying to assassinate right now?" Kind of interesting, right? Then we go to direct examination resumed. I borrowed the pistols of Mr. Cowdery in obedience to the command of Smith communicated to me by Davis. So that's an important piece right there. So the question was, did you borrow these pistols from Mr. Cowdery, and why did you borrow them? He said, I borrowed them of Mr. Cowdery in obedience to the command of Smith communicated to me by Davis. So Davis came to Denton and said, hey, we got to go kill this guy. So that's when Denton went to Mr. Cowdery and borrowed the pistols. Whew. That's some intense stuff. So, Denton is in this kind of limbo of being an ex-Mormon, an excommunicated ex-Mormon that was, floating around in anti-Mormon versus a pro-Mormon haze. He could have testified positively and said that Joseph Smith never told me to kill this Grandison Newell guy. He could have taken Smith's side in this. Or could have lied on the stand in order to make that the case. I wouldn't blame him if he was afraid of Joe, but it seems like he was basically disconnected from the Kirtland Society at this time, and then he wanted to speak the truth of what he remembered of this assassination attempt. So that's what comes out in the historical record that we're reading from here. Fascinating stuff here. Denton was, in kind of a limbo. So that was the end of Denton's testimony and his examination and cross-examination. And there are a few more witnesses that we need to get through here because we do need to see the preponderance building up of the witness testimony claiming that this conversation happened. That at some point, Joe was standing in the bank and said that Newell needed to be put out of the way. So we just need to see if there's legitimate enough historical record in this testimony, in this court document, that Joe did actually claim that Newell needed to be put out of the way. So next we have Mr. Whitney that's called on the stand. Now this, I believe, is Newell K. Whitney, who we call Father Whitney. He was one of the very first people that Joseph was close to when they first moved to Kirtland, Ohio in January of 1831. So this is Newell K. Whitney was called on the stand. Quote, he had no remembrance of hearing such conversation as had been related by witnesses to have taken place in the bank, though he has often heard Newell's name mentioned. He has heard others say, as has said himself, that if Newell should attack them at the head of a mob, he should be the first to suffer. Many rumors were afloat which caused us to expect a mob and prepare ourselves for defense. I never heard Smith threaten Newell's life. All right, so now we have somebody on the stand saying, hey, I don't ever recall that conversation happening. I was in the bank. I've been in the bank many times when Smith has been there at the same time, and I don't ever recall that happening. So then he gets questioned and cross-examined very briefly here. Question: does Smith exert much influence over his people? Answer: considerable. We feel bound to follow his directions so far as they agree with the doctrines of the Bible. Cross-examination. Witness is an officer of the society and present at all their deliberations, has never known anything of a conspiracy against Newell. Their articles of faith forbid any such thing. Have heard of Denton's borrowing pistols, and at a meeting called to inquire into his conduct, was satisfied by the witness, then called on, that he had borrowed them. Alright, so that was, Newell Whitney standing up on the witness testimony stand and saying, hey, I had heard people talk about this Grandison Newell guy, and, people didn't like him, that if he were to lead a mob into the Kirtland, that he'd be the first one to go down. But, Joe never ever threatened Newell's life, so there's that. But then, of course, the articles of faith forbid any such thing as, being like this order of conspiracy against Newell, right? That's what they're saying. Each one of these people that are called up to the stand, when they're asked, does Smith have much influence over you or over his people? They say, yeah, he does, but anything that he says, we check it with the Bible. And if the Bible says that it's true and that it's accurate, then we follow those directions. Well, I would argue that there are a lot of passages in the Bible that directly order the killing of societies of people. So if Joe orders the killing of Grandison Newell and says he's an anti-Mormon, he's an Amalekite, he is a Midianite, he's somebody that's against the will and society of God, I feel like these people could be justified in killing him and justify it through passages in the Old and New Testament. Just throwing that out there. So the next person that goes up on the stand is Luke Johnson. Now we remember Luke and Lyman Johnson are brothers. Luke and Leadfoot Lyman, I should say. And Luke Johnson was faithful in the church. He was the only Johnson brother that stayed with the church when they moved out to Salt Lake. The rest of the Johnson brothers at one point wanted to castrate Joseph Smith, because I personally believe that Joe fucked their little sister, Nancy Marinda Johnson, in 1832 and was tarred and feathered for such, and they wanted to castrate him at the same time. So this is the Johnsons that we're talking about, and this is Luke Johnson called. Quote, has heard Smith and others say, if Newell or any other man should have had a mob against them, they ought to be put out of the way, and it would be our duty to do so. There's been much excitement prevailing among us in consequence of the attack on Smith and Rigdon in Portage County, where they were tarred and feathered, and we have been ordered to arm ourselves for defense, that we might be prepared to resist similar aggressions. Here's where the cross-examination comes in, quote, I believe our only means of safety was to arm ourselves. Our enemies have several times attempted to frighten or injure us. A mob once came near our place and fired a cannon, but Smith always told us to hurt none unless they were the aggressors. I believe Smith to be a tender-hearted, humane man. End quote. Okay. So here we have, let's compare Luke Johnson, who was a faithful member of the church. Let's compare what he said. I believe Smith to be a tender-hearted, humane man that, basically, he never ordered Newell specifically to be killed or put out of the way, but anybody that leads a mob against us will be put out of the way. And he's a believing, Luke Johnson's a believing member. But then we have, Denton, who was supposedly one of the assassins, who was an excommunicated Mormon who used to be a faithful member. He's the one that says, hey, Joseph commanded me to kill this guy, and then Davis and I were basically the dudes who were supposed to do it. So, well, we see the difference in the allegiances here. Denton no longer held an allegiance to Joseph Smith, whereas Luke Johnson did. Denton said that Joseph ordered him to kill Newell, and Luke Johnson says, well, Joseph said anybody that leads a mob against us should be put out of the way, but, never said anything specifically against Newell specifically that I ever heard. So that's kind of interesting. Just the extra bit of detail that we can parse out of this in knowing that Luke Johnson was still a faithful member versus Denton's testimony, who was, an excommunicated member who no longer held those same allegiances that Luke Johnson did. Very fascinating. So the next person is extremely important. to what we're going to talk about later on in the episode. And it's Mr. Parrish, Warren Parrish, was called up to the stand. Quote, does not recollect distinctly, but thinks he had heard Newell's name mentioned at the bank, was often there when Smith was present, but has no remembrance of hearing Smith utter any threats against Newell or others. Cross-examined, where they question Warren Parrish's standing in the church. Am an officer in the church, have been acquainted with Smith for some time. Think him to be of kind and charitable disposition. Have often heard him exhort his people to do no violence. And that's the end of Warren Parrish's quote. Now, keep his in mind, because Warren Parrish, we're going to talk about him later on coming up. And the stuff... I'm super excited to get to it. But the thing is, at this time that this was going on, early June of 1837, Warren Parrish was in Joseph's favor. He was in, favor of the society. He was not an anti-Mormon at this point. But that paradigm shifts pretty soon, and we get to see something that happens later on with Warren Parrish that I think shows us a little bit more detail on the general attitude that Parrish had towards Joseph Smith at this time, and how it can shift in the matter of a couple of months. The next person that was called up to the stand was Sidney motherfucking Hinchpin Rigdon. It's the greatest. I mean, like I said, the heaviest hitters in Mormondom were up on the stand for this. Here the counsel for the prosecution rested, and Sidney Rigdon, being called on for the part of the defense, testified. Now quoting Sidney Rigdon's testimony, quote, that about 2 years since he had heard Davis and Denton had conspired against the life of Mr. Newell. That on receiving this information, he went to Smith and stated the case to him, requesting him to see to it. See how kind of diabolical this is? We have some people that are, aligned with Joseph and Sidney Rigdon that are going up on the stand and saying, I never heard of anything that happened between, Joe ordering Denton and Davis to go kill Newell. I never heard anything like that. And then here we have Sidney Rigdon on the stand saying, oh yeah, I totally heard about that. That happened 2 years ago. When I heard about Davis and Denton wanting to go kill Newell, I went and told Joe about it and said that he should go take care of that. He should go stop them. That is amazing. So Rigdon here, I have to admit, it kind of seems like he was all out for himself here, or maybe he had some kind of previous plan in order to preserve himself and Joe in this case, because damn, I mean, this is basically throwing Davis and Denton right in front of the bus in this case, right? It says, witness had never had any conversation with either Davis or Denton on the subject, of course. Smith said he had known nothing of the conspiracy until then. So Smith didn't order the execution of Newell. Davis and Denton just wanted to do it, and then when Joe and Rigdon heard about it, they tried to stop it. That's you can see how Rigdon is starting to spin this a little bit here. Witness, together with Smith, that's Rigdon and Smith, was often at bank when the prosecution of its officers was spoke of, but never heard Smith make any threats, though we often discussed the question, how far we should suffer before we offered violence in self-defense. Ooh, there's that little tiny, that last line there, that kind of adds a lot to it, doesn't it? I mean, we have Witness and Smith, we have Joe and Rigdon were at the bank often talking about how much shit they were going through with these anti-Mormon mobs and saying, how far should we suffer before we offer violence in self-defense? I think the case can be made that them wanting to kill Newell in the first place was probably done as self-preservation in some respect. I mean, they were dealing with the anti-Mormon writings and the words that this Grandison Newell was writing, and they didn't know how to deal with it, because oftentimes he was tightly weaving his anti-Mormon rhetoric with shit that was actually happening, that the Mormon church couldn't deny was going on. Especially when it came to the focus of the public on the Kirtland Safety Society company collapsing. That's when Newell and many other anti-Mormon writers had a lot of ammunition against the church and leadership. So here, Rigdon and Joe were talking about, how long before we act violently? But of course, we never actually talked about killing Newell. That was just Davis and Denton that wanted to do that. We had nothing to do with the whole thing. That's really fascinating, isn't it? I mean, Rigdon up on the stand, he sounds like he's making himself an alibi for plausible deniability with anything involved with this, and saying that Denton and Davis were acting on their own. So here the cross-examination comes up with Rigdon. He says, the reason he did not go to Davis and Denton himself on hearing of the conspiracy was because Smith had more influence on them. Davis was never considered strictly subservient to the rules of our society. Denton was excommunicated about 2 or 3 months since. So interesting. So when the cross-examination stood up and said, so when you learned of this plot that Davis and Denton had hatched to kill Newell, why did you go to Smith and tell him to handle it instead of doing it yourself? And Rigdon said, well, because Smith had more influence on them because he's the fucking prophet. Of course he does. Question, why did you let them continue in your church so long after you considered them guilty of such conduct? Answer, we suppose they had desisted from their evil course. Oh, that's fair, isn't it? It's like we thought we had heard about this whole Newell assassination attempt, but we told them not to do anything, so we were okay with it. Question, does Smith exert much influence over his followers? Interesting that they add that question on every single witness. I think it's a great question, too. Answer, yes. They regard him as an inspired man, and have regarded him in that light since I became acquainted with them and their religion, which will be 8 years the next fall. Oh, Rigdon is just diabolical, isn't he? Does Smith exert much influence over his followers? Hell yes, because he's the prophet. That's why. There we go. Question. Do you believe Joseph Smith Jr. to be a prophet? Oh, here we go. Answer. I do not believe he is such a prophet as yourself or Mr. Howe. There's laughter in parentheses there. Snarky bastard, right? So he says, do you consider Joseph Smith to be a prophet? And Rigdon said, well, I don't think he has as much profit as, Mr. Newell or Mr. Howe have. And then everybody laughs because that's such a bitch move, Rigdon. That's a way to, deflect the conversation. They're asking if, he's a prophet, and then Rigdon answers with a play on words. He doesn't have as much profit as Mr. Howe or Mr. Newell have, and people laugh it off. And then there was no follow-up question, apparently, so, Very, very interesting to have Rigdon up on the stand making such a fascinating case for himself and, creating an alibi for himself and Joe. So then we have Mr. Calhoun was called up on the testimony stand, and it says testimony in substance the same as that of Mr. Rigdon. And then it moves on to Hiram Smith, Joseph's older brother, called. Quote, witness is a brother of the defendant, went with him to Michigan last February. On their return, they were informed that Denton had said he would take defendant's life, and that he, Denton, would swear the defendant had threatened to destroy Mr. Newell. Ha! Interesting. So Hiram Smith is saying, yeah, we were in Michigan last February, and then when we came back, we heard that Denton was trying to kill Grandison Newell. And then it goes on to say, and that he, meaning Mr. Denton, would swear the defendant had threatened to destroy Mr. Newell. Witness and his brother, on arriving to Kirtland, went to the bank, there met Denton, spoke to him on the subject. Denton declared it was an absolute falsehood, a lie as black as the depths of hell. So basically, Hiram Smith went up on the stand and said that, Denton hatched this plan by himself, and then when we came back and confronted him about it, he says that it was an absolute falsehood. So not only did Joe and Hiram and Rigdon have nothing to do with this assassination, this ordered assassination attempt of Grandison Newell, when they learned about it happening, they confronted Denton about it and said, no, you can't do this. And Denton said, oh, this is an absolute falsehood, a lie as black as the depths of hell. I never had the mind to kill Grandison Newell. So that is just absolutely fascinating, isn't it? To see this, Hiram Smith is creating one possible out. Sidney Rigdon is creating another possible out. Basically, everybody is creating outs, making it possible for, Rigdon or Joe to deny any hand in this, to deny any responsibility for this assassination attempt. And then Hiram Smith is cross-examined, and there's just one line that says, believes his brother to be a prophet, an inspired man capable of revealing future events. And then, interestingly enough, we had Mr. Calhoun recalled by the prosecution. Believes Joseph Smith Jr. to be a prophet. Believes that he translated the Golden Bible. And that's it. There is one more paragraph in this entire newspaper publication here, and I think it enlightens us on the outcome of everything here that we've talked about so far. It said, some other witnesses were called, but their testimony was similar to that of the last two or three. The summing up and arguments of the counsel on both sides were remarkably clear, able, and eloquent, and the whole affair terminated by the courts requiring Mr. Joseph Smith Jr. $500 bonds for his appearance at court. Rigdon, Hyde, and Denton each $50 for their appearance as witnesses in the case. End quote. All right. We need to talk about this trial in the abstract for a minute. As discussed before reading the court notes, we have no way of knowing whether or not Joe and Rigdon actually commanded Davis and Denton to kill Grandison Newell, or whether it was all a fabrication by these anti-Mormons, Newell and Howe, just to, get Joe thrown in jail or, hung for conspiracy of murder and acts of tyranny. Let's be clear about this. When Mormons talk about the persecution by anti-Mormons, these are the real people they use to substantiate that claim. Newell, Hurlbut, Howe, and a large helping of other ministers and reporters hated Mormonism at this time, and they had motivation to cause Joe trouble. It's entirely possible that Newell fabricated these charges, completely dreamt them up out of whole cloth. I don't think that's very likely. I don't think the court record, necessarily plays that out as being the case, but that is a possibility and we can't ignore it. But personally, I think there's a likely explanation hiding somewhere in everything that we've read about this exchange between Joe Rigdon and Newell. Okay, Grandison Newell was a rich guy in Painesville. He was good friends with Eber Howe, the first real anti-Mormon author, and Newell had resources and contacts to throw around. And at one point, he bragged that he had spent $1,000 on lawsuits to, quote, annoy the prophet, end quote. He was closely associated with the 3 legislators in Ohio that reviewed the Kirtland Safety Society bank charter in late 1836, so Newell may have had something to do with the Kirtland Safety Society company not being granted bank status in early 1837. I mean, Newell really was a genuine asshole to Joe and Rigdon. We can never possibly understand why he felt the need to be such an asshole. That's kind of the problem here. But we can't presume that that relationship was a one-way street. Joe wasn't just Newell's punching bag. He must have hated Newell just as much as Newell hated Joe. This was a time when Joe had countless other stressors weighing him down. Trusted leaders were preaching against Joe and his leadership. The Kirtland Safety Society company was issuing its last notes before closing its doors. Anti-Mormon publications were now so rampant that P-Cubed was tasked with writing a 50-page book in refutation of anti-Mormon slander that was coming out of the Painesville Telegraph and other media outlets. This says nothing about the status of the church in Missouri, where frequent mob violence was removing church members from their homes and leading to beatings in the streets. Joe had evolved into the mob boss we've been anticipating for so long. What was Joe's phrase? What was it? Put him aside where the crows can't find him? Bump him off, clip him, take out a contract on him, do him up, hit him, burn him, ice him, knock him off, rub him out, whack him. All thinly veiled euphemisms. Personally, I think Joe did it. This is my naked assessment of the situation, so take that for what it's worth, but I think Joe was under enough pressure that he could justify a person being killed for the greater good. When Joe made his March of Zion's camp in 1834, he did so with enough conviction to expect a battle and the loss of life. Of course, he chickened out by the time the army actually crossed the Missouri border, but he initially organized that group of 200 armed men to be a killing mob. That was back in the good old days, long before any of this crazier shit we're talking about now was going on. That was before his life had been threatened multiple times by his own underlings. That was long before the church had incurred tens of thousands of dollars in debt and was fighting off creditors by any means necessary. I think that if Newell posed enough of a threat to the church, Joe and Rigdon never would have had a problem with justifying a righteous killing for the Lord's kingdom. We're only a few months away from Rigdon's famed assault sermon, where he basically demands a violent resolution to the anti-Mormon mobs in Missouri. Life and death is the game that Joe and Rigdon were playing by mid-1837, by the time we're talking about right now in the Mormon historical timeline. Life and death. You know, that's possibly why I see this as so plausible in its historical accuracy. You know, the fact that Joe actually asked for an assassination here. I mean, there's always a chance that Newell and Howe just trumped up these charges against Joe for the assassination attempt. But I think that it really happened. I think that Joe and Rigdon met in the dark third-floor room of the Kirtland printing office and school and said distinctly to one another that Grandison Newell is a problem and needs to be dealt with, or put out of the way, as they said it. Having been convinced by each other's fears and lack of de-escalation skills, Joe and Rigdon came up with two worthy and willing members in the church that would be capable of carrying out the task. Two fall guys. Here enters Davis and Denton. Now, Davis and Denton were two younger men trying to establish a name for themselves in the Mormon fraternity. So, they're not even made men at this point. They're just gullible and capable enough to carry out this task. Joe approached them with a revelation from God to put Newell out of the way, to make all of Rigdon's and Joe's troubles solve themselves. And once it came down to it, Davis and Denton were too good of people to actually carry out the wish of their prophet, boss, seer, and revelator, but unfortunately, Newell heard them rustling around in the bushes and figured out the plot, leading to the lawsuit trial that we just read. The thing is, Joe was in a life or death situation. At least it could have been perceived as such. And once a person crosses that threshold, they'll go to life and death lengths to preserve their own life. Death threats weren't just coming from anti-Mormons, they were coming from Joe's own trusted council of the 12 apostles. Why would the threat of life or death with an anti-Mormon like Newell be treated with anything other than life or death in response? That's the response that I think Joe was driven to. Now, this trial didn't conclude guilty on the part of Joe and Rigdon. But why would it? The evidence was all hearsay, and Newell didn't have any gunshot holes in his house or in his body to provide evidence for the assassination attempt. There was just no legal standing to conclude guilt of attempted murder. What did happen is Newell continued to sue the fuck out of Joe and rack up owed debts. Now, I haven't seen substantiation for this. This is my own kind of naked assessment of what happened and what the future of the timeline holds. But we'll talk about that in a few episodes. But the only thing that I can figure is that Newell knew that the Kirtland money was worthless and that he could hold Joe and the church legally to repaying it after its imminent collapse. In January of 1838, a verdict was reached and Joe was held in fault and ended up owing Grandison Newell approximately $38,000. The only way that I can make this work in my brain is that Newell bought up a whole bunch of Kirtland Safety Society company paper just to be a nuisance to Joe, just so he could bring up a lawsuit against Joe and make money off of the collapsed economy. Like I said, Newell had liquid cash. He was a rich bastard, and he could play with it. He didn't much mind spending money for the entertainment value. I think that's why he bought up all this Kirtland Safety Society money, so that eventually he could just sue Joe and hold him accountable for it. Every dollar of Kirtland Safety Society money that Grandison Newell held, he could sue Joe for and receive payment for. That was part of the founding articles of the Kirtland Safety Society in 1837. So I think that's what happened. Now, like I said, I haven't seen substantiation for that, but that's the only way that it possibly makes sense in my mind. But Newell isn't done in our timeline. He was awarded the damages for about $38,000. We'll pick that up next episode. But then he reappears in our timeline in the late 1850s. Just remember that name, Grandison Newell, the most wonderful anti-Mormon pain in Joe's ass that exposed church weakness in the 1830s and called Joe and Rigdon evil blasphemers that even the devil himself would struggle to follow. Amazing. Love this Grandison Newell guy. So let's move the timeline on a little bit here. We had to take a step back from where last episode ended in order to discuss this Newell trial, but it was just too good to overlook, and I'm ashamed that I overlooked it last episode. We've overlooked the majority of Joe's trials up to this point. We've only read a couple of the more important ones, the 1826 trial, the two trials that happened in 1 week in 1831. I mean, those have been the important ones and we've read those, but this was a monumental trial. One where Joseph Smith was being accused of an assassination attempt. That's not just something you can glass over and move on from. So now that we've covered it, we've talked about it, let's move on through 1837 and try to catch us up to where last episode ended. So by the end of August 1837, Joe and friends had returned from their mission to Canada. After the Grandison Newell trial, they ran up to Canada. They fled there, were there for a month and a half, and then they came back in at the end of August. So last episode, we talked about the September 4th church conference, where Joe didn't sustain some of the members of the Quorum of the 12, which was an unprecedented level of dissent in the ranks that was chipping away the already shaky foundation of the church. Joe also heavily chastised the maligned leaders. On September 4th, 1837, this church conference was held, during which Joe chastised various leaders of the church. This chastisement also accompanied not sustaining those people as members of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles. This is something that's taken very seriously in the church, especially today. If Thomas Monson, today's prophet, were to stand up in conference and say that some of the quorum weren't sustained in their calling, it would be an epic paradigm shift in the current perception of unity in church leadership. When Joe didn't sustain these members as faithful leaders in the church, it marked that same paradigm shift in unity. Where some people perceived unity among Joe and friends before, the social pressures building up had finally taken their toll and really expressed the corrosion in this church unity that had been so long chipping away at Joe and Rigdon's foundation. Of the leaders that were chastised on September 4th, 3 of them, namely Luke and Leadfoot Lyman Johnson, as well as John F. Boynton, made a confession to the church and then retained their apostleship immediately afterwards. This was one very small reconciliation in a time of infinite strife and disagreement in the church. It really wouldn't last long, trust me. So on September 27th, 3 weeks after the September 4th conference, Joe and his little brother, Crazy Willie Smith, along with Hingepin Rigdon and possibly some others, left for far west Missouri to deal with the dissent that was happening out there. They were on a damage control mission to rein in the terrible two brothers, D-Day David and John Goebbels Whitmer. The Whitmers were essentially running their own church, anathema to the Kirtland church, and personal action was needed on the part of Joe to respond to this new level of insurrection that was happening. Joe had made some mistakes in the past when he left town, and he wasn't too eager to repeat those mistakes. If we remember to just 1 year before this, Joe left Kirtland for the treasure digging trip up in Salem, Massachusetts, taking with him Hingepin Rigdon and Hiram Smith and a few others. Now, while Joe and friends were on their way back from Massachusetts, the Whitmers and Jacob Bump and plenty of others in the leadership were planning to kill Joe upon his return. Life or death here, right? Bloody Brigham even hightailed it up to New York with Crazy Willie Smith to pick up Joe and get him back sooner and in safety. It seems like any time Joe tried to leave to conduct other business in a place other than the headquarters in Kirtland, people would try to take advantage of that little hiatus and, usurp the mantle from him or plan an assassination attempt on the part of the prophet. Well, Joe learned from these mistakes. So before leaving for Far West to straighten out the Whitmers and the church out there, Joe created a leadership that he could trust, essentially culling the weakest links that he thought would be most likely to cause problems in his absence. This is a passage from the History of the Church, Volume 2, page 511, covering the time right before Joe and friends headed to Far West, Missouri. It starts with talking about Ollie and D-Day David, as well as a guy named Leonard Rich, whose name has only come up, I think, maybe once in our timeline before now. Quote, announcement concerning Oliver Cowdery. Dear brethren, Oliver Cowdery has been in transgression. But as he is now chosen as one of the presidents or counselors, I trust that he will yet humble himself and magnify his calling. But if he should not, the church will soon be under the necessity of raising their hands against him. Therefore, pray for him. David Whitmer, Leonard Rich, and others have been in transgression, but we hope that they may be humble and ere long make satisfaction to the church. Otherwise, they cannot retain their standing. Therefore we say unto you, beware of all disaffected characters, for they come not to build up, but to destroy and scatter abroad. Though we or an angel from heaven preach any other gospel, or introduce an order of things other than those things which ye have received, and are authorized to receive from the first presidency, let him be accursed. May God Almighty bless you all, and keep you unto the coming and kingdom of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. Yours in the bond of the new covenant, Joseph Smith, Jr. I received the following revelation given at Kirtland, Ohio, September 4th, 1837, making known the transgression of John Whitmer and William Wines Phelps. Verily, thus saith the Lord unto you, my servant Joseph. My servants John Whitmer and William Wines Phelps have done those things which are not pleasing in my sight. Therefore, if they repent not, they shall be removed out of their places. Amen. And I think that's been adapted into the current day Book of Covenants, but I'm not 100% sure. The next entry is for September 9th. And it says, the High Council of Kirtland met in the Lord's house and organized by electing Jared Carter president and Phineas Richards clerk. The members elected on the 3rd were ordained and drew for their numbers, and the whole were arranged as follows. John P. Green first, Asael Smith second. That Asael Smith, that was Joe's uncle, named after Joe's grandfather, who was also named Asael. Samuel Smith third, Mayhew Hillman fourth, William Marks fifth, Noah Packard sixth, Oliver Granger seventh, David Dort eighth, Jared Carter 9th, Phineas Richards 10th, Henry G. Sherwood 11th, and Harlow Redfield 12th. End quote. So Joe appointed these men that we just listed to be the new leaders in Kirtland, while he and Rigdon went to Missouri to straighten out the church that was in Far West. You see, this rampant infighting and dissent was happening in Missouri just as much as it was happening in Kirtland, but Rigdon and Joe were 800 miles away, and they were unable to maintain any sense of dominance out there. The Whitmers and Double Dub, William Wines Phelps, we know him as Double Dub, Double W, they were running the show out there, and Joe had released public statements that they were in transgression. Joe had also claimed that Ollie was out of line as well. But this was the exact wording of it. It says, Oliver Cowdery has been in transgression, but as he is now chosen as one of the presidents or counselors, because, he was one of the founding fathers of the church, I trust that he will yet humble himself and magnify his calling. There we go. I trust that he's going to be a good boy and not do any shit that's going to make me mad. But if he should not, the church will soon be under the necessity of raising their hands against him. Therefore, pray for him. That was a threat that Ollie better do his fucking job or we're going to have some problems, Buster, you hear? I mean, Ollie was in a very tentative place in the church. But he wasn't the only one. I mean, people everywhere in the church had lost their entire life savings with the collapse of the Kirtland Safety Society Company. More people were even talking about the fucked up little affair between Joe and Fanny Alger, and also possibly with a Miss Hill. We're not really certain there. Yeah, remember that shit? People were livid that the prophet had an affair, and everybody was talking about that. Now you factor in the anointing oil abuse, and Joe wasn't looking like much of a prophet lately. More like a mafia boss with drugs and women problems, who was masquerading as a holier-than-thou prophet. The list of people that Joe and Rigdon could trust was getting shorter every minute. The gang had fled to Canada in July after this Newell trial, and they had a dumpster fire to deal with upon their return to Kirtland in August. After a few weeks of getting things straightened out, Ollie left for Missouri on September 17th, planning to be the permanent eyes and ears of the prophet, proving his loyalty by moving to Missouri to redeem his trustworthiness, thus magnifying his calling. And then 10 days later, on the 27th of September, Joe, Rigdon, Vincent Knight, Crazy Willie Smith, Joe's little brother, all four of them left for far west Missouri. The second they step foot out of town, the Kirtland church implodes. Now, Joe had haphazardly constructed a small house of cards on top of a shaky foundation, and the minute he wasn't watching and people knew that he and Rigdon would be gone for almost 3 months, shit went down. Now that's a lot of time. 3 months. That's a lot of time with no supervision for things to change. I should add that one person that could be trusted by Joe his entire life was his father, Joseph Smith Sr., as we know him, Big Daddy Cheese. He was always faithful to his son's religion and never faltered until the day he died. Big Daddy Cheese was left the patriarch in charge of the newly arranged Quorum of the 12 Apostles, while Joe and Rigdon got to the Missouri church and tried to get it under control. Now, Big Daddy Cheese was there to try and rein in some of the chaos that ensued. But he was just one man. What could he really do against the tides and forces of this frustrated cult that so desperately wanted to depose the prophet from his throne? Upon the leadership's departure, a chaotic scene unfolded. This is something recounted from Eliza R. Snow's personal writings, years after the occurrence. Of course, Eliza R. Snow was one of Joe's wives, and we largely have her to thank when it came to the scholarship on Joe's polygamous relationships. She recounts a story about the pandemonium gripping the Kirtland church once Joe and friends left for Missouri. There's a link for her article in the show notes. Quote, Warren Parrish, who had stood on the stand on behalf of Joseph Smith just before, remember, we were talking about him, he was on the stand during that Grandison Newell trial, Warren Parrish, who had been a humble, successful preacher of the gospel, was the ringleader of this apostate party. One Sabbath morning, he with several of his party came into the temple armed with pistols and bowie knives, and seated themselves together in the Aaronic pulpits on the east end of the temple, while Father Smith and others, as usual, occupied those of the Melchizedek priesthood on the west. This Warren Parrish guy, gotta love him. Soon after the usual opening services, one of the brethren on the west stand arose, and just after he commenced to speak, one on the east interrupted him. Father Smith, presiding, called to order. He told the apostate brother that he should have all the time he wanted, but he must wait his turn, as the brother on the west took the floor and commenced first to speak. He must not be interrupted. A fearful scene ensued. The apostate speaker, meaning Warren Parrish, becoming so clamorous that Father Smith called for the police to take the man out of the house, when Parrish, John Boynton, and others drew their pistols and bowie knives and rushed down from the stand into the congregation. John Boynton saying, "I'll blow out the brains of the first man who dare lay hands on me." Many in the congregation, especially women and children, were terribly frightened. Some tried to escape from the confusion by jumping out of the windows. Amid screams and shrieks, the policemen, in ejecting the belligerents, knocked down a stovepipe, which fell helter-skelter among the people. But Although bowie knives and pistols were wrested from their owners and thrown hither and thither to prevent disastrous results, no one was hurt. And after a short but terrible scene to be enacted in a temple of God, order was restored, and the services of the day proceeded as usual. Wow. She continues, but the next day, Father Smith and 16 others were arrested on complaint of the apostate party, charged with riot, and bound over for their appearance in court to answer to the charge. With others, I was subpoenaed as a witness, and I found the court scene as amusing as the temple scene was appalling. The idea of such a man as Father Smith, so patriarchal in appearance, so circumspect in deportment and dignified in his manners, being guilty of riot, was at once ludicrous and farcical to all sane-minded persons. And after the 4 Gentile lawyers, 2 for each party, had expended their stock of wit, the court dismissed the case with no cause for action, and Father Smith and his associates came off triumphant. End quote. How about that shit? A fight breaking out in the temple during which bowie knives and pistols were drawn and aimed at people. The police apparently had to come in and remove Warren Parrish and his posse of apostates because they were raising hell during church services that were presided by Big Daddy Cheese. The day after that, Parrish presumably filed a complaint against Big Daddy Cheese for rioting in the church, and during the trial it was found that the pious father of the pious prophet wasn't to blame for it. You just have to wonder what was said, or in what context this outrage arose. I mean, to be a fly on the wall. Let me just be clear here, a little bit of transparency. Eliza Snow's account is the only extant account of this thing happening. Historians aren't sure if this outburst actually happened or not, but Eliza Snow seems to be recounting it with a fair amount of detail, and she's historically known to be a fairly trustworthy source, so take that how you will. But let's talk about it as if it really did happen. I don't think it's too much of a stretch to think that this actually happened. It's perfectly believable in my mind. Warren Parrish had joined the church in the spring of 1833. He'd participated in Zion's camp, he'd helped with the translation of the Egyptian papyri, and he had been official scribe for Joe for the past 2 years by this time in 1837. There's no argument that Parrish wasn't a faithful member of the church and a sincere believer in Joe and Rigdon's leadership. He'd served missions, put his life in danger, and given years of his life and countless of his dollars into this church. He was a devoted member. What would lead a level-headed person like Warren Parrish into a situation where he's pulling out guns and pointing them at people in church? Now, Big Daddy Cheese was presiding over the congregation, and while one man was talking, Parrish stood up and began arguing with that man. Big Daddy Cheese called the place to order and, told Parrish to shut up and wait his turn, and then apparently at that point, Parrish had enough, and he pulled out his pistol and brandished his bowie knife in the middle of the church while yelling at the men that were trying to silence him. Now, Big Daddy Cheese called for the police, and they stormed in and pulled the maddened, struggling Parrish out by his arms, pulling the pistols out of his hands. Now, it may have even been more people than just Parrish, for the way that Eliza Snow makes it sound. There was a bunch of them. There may have even been, 5, 10, 20 people that pulled out their pistols, according to Snow's account here. Now, I can only picture 2 scenarios that make this believable. More scenarios possibly exist than these 2, but these 2 seem to make sense to me, and it serves to explain everything that happened. We have either scenario 1 or scenario 2 in my mind here. Either scenario 1, the first man that was speaking was calling Parrish out for being unfaithful, and then Parrish got riled up in defense of himself, and then felt the need to, for some reason, pull out guns so that the people would listen and pay attention to what he's actually saying. I think this is entirely possible. Parrish was a good member of the church and had a large amount of his personal wealth tied up in the Kirtland Safety Society company that had collapsed a few months before this. He probably thought that Joe was an asshole for cheating on Emma with that house girl Alger and Hill. And, a lot of people felt that same way about Joe at this time. And maybe the man that was speaking up in the congregation was calling Parrish out as being unfaithful or in transgression against the church or something, as Joe had publicly done so before. So, out of desperation to be heard, Parrish stood up and made his case that the prophet has been lying and making money off land speculation and using his position of authority to influence the Kirtland Safety Society economy and just fuck people over, charging him with priestcraft and all that fun stuff. Now, of course, this would anger some people in the congregation, and maybe a few Parrish sympathizers started yelling. Maybe some Joe sympathizers on the other side of the congregation started yelling back. Everybody gets excited, people draw their guns in escalation to try and get to the other side to listen, and, it just devolves after that. That's scenario one. It sounds perfectly believable, doesn't it? But let's go the other way and read it as it's portrayed in Eliza Snow's account to see just how believable that situation sounds. Let's just say, scenario 2, that Parrish was so disenchanted by Joe and Rigdon's leadership that he wanted to start his own religion by taking over the existing Mormonite church. Let's just say that he was the ringleader of the apostate party, as Eliza called him specifically. How fucking insane would it be to watch that situation play out? Just picture this for a minute. Parrish, once faithful, now turned anti-Mormon, begins talking with his fellow defectors in dark rooms and back alleys, while Joe and Rigdon are trying to reinstate peace and tranquility in Kirtland. The Parrishites hatch a plan that as soon as Rigdon and Joe have their back turned, they're going to take over the church by force in an armed coup. Then, on September 27th, the majority of Joe's trusted friends in leadership of the church head out on a 1,600-mile round-trip journey to put out fires in Missouri, thus creating the opening that Parrish and his merry band of apostates were seeking to overthrow the Mormon throne. The first meeting of October comes, and the evil collusion of apostates are prepared to implement their dastardly plan. The meeting begins as usual, but halfway through, when one of the members is bearing his testimony, Parrish stands up and gives the signal. "Now, men, do your duty to Zion!" Parrish and 3 other men pull out their pistols and run through the congregation, attempting to reach the stand and take over the pulpit. Big Daddy Cheese yells for the faithful Joe supporters in the crowd to help and to go get the police, and a brawl ensues. Guns are discharged, but nobody's shot, and a couple of men trade punches. But mostly it's just yelling and shoving, as men are often wont to do when they're under this much pressure and enormous debt from the Kirtland Safety Society company scandal. The next day, a church court is held to determine if Parrish was at fault when he created this uprising, or if Big Daddy Cheese and friends were at fault for supporting a fallen prophet. Of course, no guilt is found on the part of the church leadership, and Warren Parrish, along with his fellow Parrishites, are maligned in society as anti-Mormon apostates that tried to overthrow the church. Now, this second scenario sounds, it's more action movie, but it's a little less believable than the first scenario. The first scenario is just, tensions are running high and people are impulsively pulling out their guns. But at least the second scenario goes along with how Eliza Snow reported it, and it helps to explain the fact that Warren Parrish did indeed break off after this and found his own church of Parrishite Mormons. They were known as the Parrishites. Warren Parrish led his own church. That's the problem with reading about this time in Mormon history. There are multiple ways to possibly interpret any given scene, especially one involving a gang of apostates brandishing pistols and bowie knives. That's the point I'm trying to get across here. Pandemonium. The church was amidst a fog of utter chaos in 1837. Any problems Joe was dealing with, prior to this year in our timeline pale in comparison to how frantic and confusing this year was to Joe and friends. One thing for certain, none of what we see leads me to believe that anybody was in control at this time. It's one of the great wonders of the earth, how Joe was able to keep this fucking train wreck on the rails and still somehow emerge from this time victorious. It's simply baffling to see such disarray and turmoil exist in the highest ranks of trusted church officials, not to mention the anti-Mormons that were bringing up lawsuits like Grandison Newell. There are so many letters to get to and so many people that apostatized during this time. There's a distinction I want to make before closing out the historical portion of this episode. The distinction to which I'm referring defines the groups of anti-Mormons. The label of anti-Mormon mob is repeatedly oversimplified in the Mormon narrative of its own history. Anytime we hear about problems in the church, they were usually started by an anti-Mormon mob or some anti-Mormon writer that was publishing falsehoods about the church. It's a far too elementary perspective with which to view this time in Mormon history. Those people did exist, don't get me wrong. The majority of this episode was spent talking about an anti-Mormon society that hated Joe and Rigdon and the church and just wanted to raise hell for them. Eber Howe and Grandison Newell and others, they were people that had influence in the media with an anti-Mormon agenda, and they were successful at creating problems for Joe and the church and spreading anti-Mormon beliefs. These men had family members that had joined the church, and they thought this church to be the church of the devil, so they were motivated to bring it down. That is definitely one group of anti-Mormons that existed and actively persecuted the church since the very early days of its foundation. Then we have people like Warren Parrish and Dr. Philastus Hurlbut and Snyder and Sylvester Smith and Martin Harris, who were faithful members of the church for a long period of time. And then they had some kind of experience that caused them to question and leave the church and become anti-Mormons. That's our second group of anti-Mormons. People that were members of the church at one point and left in order to crusade against the church. Now, while these two different groups of anti-Mormons may collude occasionally, like when Dr. Philastus Hurlbut sold his work on the Solomon Spaulding theory to the anti-Mormon Eber Howe, the two groups are very different in that one small detail of their past. The anti-Mormons persecuted the church constantly, but the ex-Mormon anti-Mormons only persecuted the church once they realized it was bullshit and had left. That's one small distinction between these groups that makes a very big difference. We see this chaos and discordance play out with Joe and Rigdon taking shit from anti-Mormons and ex-Mormon anti-Mormons who are all angry about the same dishonesty and scandals that were going on at the hands of Joe and Rigdon. These anti-Mormon sentiments and articles that were coming out weren't without foundation. At this time, a lot of the ex-Mormon anti-Mormons had lost a significant portion of their life savings with the Kirtland Safety Society Company bullshit. Parrish was one of the hundreds that were negatively affected by it. A lot of these same ex-Mormon anti-Mormons had devoted years of their life to the church, calling Joe an enlightened prophet of God, claiming the Book of Mormon to be the newest one true word of God. And once the veil was pulled back, and they saw Joe and his fuck-ups for what they really were, just that, fuck-ups, it's easy to see why somebody like Parrish may go to such lengths of pulling a gun on somebody. This was life or death for some people. And it must have been life or death for Joe and Rigdon if Newell is to be believed in his claim that they tried to have him killed. There's just no putting ourselves there in a way that we can actually experience the feelings and the social pressures that were going on in late 1837. But luckily, we have a bunch of first-hand accounts to peruse. We may not be able to feel it for ourselves, but we can read what people wrote about the general feeling at the time. This is an oration that Sidney Rigdon delivered a little less than a year after this. He delivered it on July 4th, Independence Day in 1838 in Far West, Missouri. And it almost sounds like something that came from Bill Pullman. Quote, "And that a mob that comes on us to disturb us, it shall be between us and them a war of extermination. For we will follow them till the last drop of their blood is spilt, or else they will have to exterminate us. For we will carry the seat of war to their own houses and their own families, and one party or the other shall be utterly destroyed. We this day then proclaim ourselves free, with a purpose and a determination that can never be broken. No, never, no, never, no, never." End quote. That coming from a man that commands an armed mob of Danites? That's not an idle threat. We've long since passed this point of a hunky-dory, funny shenanigans Joe and Rigdon occasionally got into. Are they going treasure hunting today, or are they going to go buy some Egyptian papyri just for fun? Gone are those days. This shit is life or death now. The Mormon religion was a death cult by this point, wielding massive political and ecclesiastical power, swaying the masses to vote a certain way or even take up arms against the so-called anti-Mormon mobocrats. I'm just glad that I live in a time where being an ex-Mormon, anti-Mormon writer won't actually get me killed like it might have when Joseph Smith or Brigham Young were still alive. You know, maybe Tommy would like that, but it wouldn't go over in the headlines very well. So I suppose I'm pretty thankful that the church is so PR friendly nowadays. (1837) and 38 can be looked over in a blink of an eye. I mean, we could cover everything pertinent in one episode, honestly, but never in Mormon history had things been so convoluted and confusing before this point. We have to take these years slow so we don't miss anything. Now, last historical episode ended with the September conference. This episode backtracked 3 months to June of 1837, and then only advanced us 2 months beyond September, where we ended last episode. This is some dense stuff that we're wading through, and I hope there aren't any major holes that I'm leaving in our wake of research through this, needless to say, foggy and unforgiving time in Mormon history. Hopefully you'll bear with me as we get through everything that I can find out about this time. But I sincerely hope that you're having as much fun as I am with researching the church in 1837 and 38. There's so many things that I'm keeping stored up my sleeve that I can't wait to tell you guys about, but we'll just have to get there in later episodes. A little bit of an update. Have to give everybody an update on what happened last week's episode. So last week, if you listened in last episode, you'll know that we launched a Kickstarter campaign to create a hub of Central Mormon research, where we're trying to create a place where a lot of people, historians and, lay readers alike can come together and learn about Mormonism. And I want to give an update on that and how it's going right now. We're 6 days into the campaign right now, and we already have 6 backers. More than $600 have been pledged of the total goal, so that's super fantastic. I'm absolutely stoked about the success of the campaign so far, and I just wanted to thank everybody that has pledged up to this point. The 6 of you are fantastic. Of course, if you are interested in checking out the Kickstarter campaign, you can listen to last episode or watch last episode. It was kind of rough to listen to, I have to admit. There's a video version of it, but Dan, who was one of the 3 people that was on the line at the time, his internet had a really terrible connection, and it's kind of hard to listen to it because it's starty and stoppy and just kind of annoying. But what we're going to do to remediate that problem is have him on next week's episode, and he and I are just going to talk about the website and about what he is doing, what his project is, because he's a fascinating guy, and I got connected with him based off of a YouTube video that he made some time ago that I plugged in the show when I first happened upon it. Thanks to David Michael, of course. But Dan and I are going to basically redo the episode, talk about everything, in a way that you'll be able to hear instead of just hearing audio silence and clicks and whatnot, thanks to Google Hangouts, really low threshold of quality on the contact. So, that being said, next week's episode is going to be, basically a revamp or a revisit of the realbookofmormon.org, Kickstarter campaign that we have launched. And hopefully that will continue to gain funding and people will continue to be interested in that. Check the link in the show notes for this episode for a link to that Kickstarter campaign. You can watch a video, a 10-minute video that I made for the campaign that describes what the project is. You can check out the website and all of the rewards that we have for people that pledge certain dollar amounts. So, that being said, thank you very much to everybody that has pledged to help out on that. And I look forward to doing a listener mail segment and everything next week's episode after Dan and I talk about the project, and we'll just go from there. But before calling this episode good and closing her out tonight, I need to thank a few people at the end of the episode, like usual. First off, I want to thank Demonista for running the Facebook page and posting up things on there all the time. She does a great job there. Be sure to check out the Facebook page. Just search for Naked Mormonism. Also want to thank Jason Camo for providing the music that's used in this show with his permission. If you're interested in hearing this song specifically that's playing in the background right now, you go to his episode and go to the albums tab and go to the album 3, Portsmouth. This song is called Drift Away from Safe Harbor, Catch the Wind in Your Sails, Explore, Dream, Discover. Fantastic song. Also need to thank Craig Keeling for providing the artwork that's used in this show, as well as the Daughter Podcast. For his blog, you can go to weirdmormonshit.com. Need to thank all of the patrons who support the show on patreon.com/nakedmormonism. They make a per episode donation there. That is endlessly appreciated of you. You are all fantastic people. Thank you. I also want to thank everybody that rates the show on iTunes or Stitcher or their podcasting app of choice. But most of all, I need to thank you blasphemously glorious listeners for lending me your ear. I hope to talk to you next time here on the Naked Mormonism Podcast. Thanks for sticking around for the end of the episode. I now present to you The Golden Bible, written by Grandison Newell circa May 1837.
A new golden Bible was lately discovered, which for 6,000 years could not be found, but was lately by hoes, spades, and shovels uncovered. The new golden Bible, the new fangled Bible, the fictitious Bible that lay underground. The law-giving Moses went up to the mount. Fire, earthquakes, and darkness encircled him round. They were written, the heathens were smitten, but safe was the Bible that lay underground. But Joshua next in the line of succession fought, conquered, and spread desolation around. Approved by his God, he adorned his profession, but ne'er saw the Bible that lay underground. King David was set as a brilliant example. His praises were sung by the ladies' sweet sound, performed mighty deeds o'er the Philistines trampled, but ne'er found the Bible that lay underground. King Solomon was wiser than any before, a house built for God as a star on his crown. But for his great wisdom many adore him, but he ne'er read the Bible that lay underground. There's Daniel the captive, whose prophetic vision rose high and dug deep into darkness profound, foretelling strange things with the utmost precision, but he spake not of Mormon that lay underground. Nehemiah the cupbearer prayed for his nation, and was sent to rebuild what the heathen pulled down, removed the old rubbish and laid the foundation, but raised not the Bible that lay underground. The prophets foretold of the glorious Messiah, and the shadows and types of the day abound, but ne'er a word from the prophetic lyre about the new Bible that lay underground. John Baptist's forerunner repentance came preaching, and thousands to hear him did gather around, and many were pricked to the heart by his teachings, though he saw not the Bible that lay underground. When Luther rebelled from Rome's constitution, he aimed at popery for to put it down, yet nothing appeared of the late speculation of the new golden Bible that lay underground. Next appeared Calvin in the Great Reformation, a man of ability and famed for renown. He assisted Luther in his great undertaking, yet he saw not the Bible that lay underground. At length appeared Wesley, a Fletcher, a Coke, and skilled in the arts that before them were found. Amidst all their learning, they never have spoke about the new Bible that lay underground. At length arose Campbell from the old Scottish nation, and with his great learning did many confound. With all his researchers, likewise meditation, he found not the Bible that lay underground. Then Smith, that is Joseph, the prophet indeed, in search of some treasures at last he has found, a pair of white glasses of stone it is said, and they saw the Bible that lay underground. Joe Smith has pretended to new revelation, while angels and spirits encircled him round. He professed to translate by divine inspiration the new golden Bible that he dug from the ground. 'Twas through the stone glasses those wonderful stories were read to the people with sacred renown, in language unknown that mysterious glories, unfolded by Mormon just raised from the ground. Joe Smith and S. Rigdon, the chiefs of their people, while declaring abroad the new gospel they had found, got their bodies well covered with tar and good feathers, for spreading the Bible they raised from the ground. The Mormons have built them a mighty great tower, in which they declare many angels abound, to endow them afresh with apostolic power, proved by the new Bible they raised from the ground. The new golden Bible, the new fangled Bible, the fictitious Bible that lay underground.